The geopolitical landscape of North America was rocked by a seismic shift that no one saw coming. In a stunning move that took the world by surprise, Canada abruptly severed America's land bridge to Alaska, effectively cutting off a vital logistical and transportation route that has been in place for decades. The closure of the Alaska Highway, a crucial artery for U.S. access to its far northern state, represents not just a political or logistical decision, but a sharp, aggressive escalation in tensions between two neighboring countries that were once bound by decades of diplomatic and economic cooperation. What initially began as a diplomatic memo from Ottawa, hinting at growing concerns over a variety of economic, military, and environmental issues, quickly spiraled out of control. This diplomatic note soon evolved into an unanticipated crisis, one that swiftly escalated from a relatively contained dispute to a full-blown continental disaster. The sheer magnitude of the decision took the U.S. by surprise, sending shockwaves through the American government and military as they scrambled to address the unfolding crisis and its far-reaching consequences. At first, it seemed like just another tense but manageable dispute between two long-standing allies. However, the ramifications of Canada's actions soon became undeniable. The closure of the Alaska Highway wasn't simply a matter of roadblocks and logistical challenges. It represented a direct challenge to American hegemony in the North American continent. For years, the U.S. has relied on its access to Alaska through Canada for strategic military positioning, resource extraction, and trade routes that connect the mainland to this distant and strategic region. Now, with the highway closed, America's ability to assert its dominance and carry out military operations in the Arctic is under direct threat. The move had far-reaching implications that extended beyond the immediate logistics of travel and commerce. In an era where geopolitical tensions have been escalating across the globe, Canada's decision to sever this crucial link between the U.S. and Alaska has revealed significant vulnerabilities in Washington's strategic positioning. The United States, accustomed to projecting power across the globe without worrying about its northern neighbor, now faces a new reality, one in which its security and economic interests in the Arctic are directly threatened by a country that, until recently, was considered an ally. This action, unexpected and swift, also has broader implications for international relations. While the U.S. government scrambled to reassess its position in North America, two of America's most powerful rivals, China and Russia, quickly recognized the opportunity that had been presented. Both countries, who have been increasingly active in the Arctic region, began to recalibrate their strategies, understanding that the U.S. could no longer rely on its old routes and military access to the far north. Canada's decision to sever the Alaska Highway, while not an overt military action, nonetheless left America vulnerable in a region that has become increasingly vital to global trade, energy, and military strategy. The ripple effects of this dramatic decision began to destabilize global markets almost immediately. With the Alaska Highway closed, trade between the U.S. and Canada came to an abrupt halt, and concerns grew about how this would affect the flow of goods, resources, and energy throughout the continent. Alaska, known for its oil, natural gas, and strategic military bases, suddenly became isolated from the rest of the U.S., making it harder for American forces to deploy to the region. The U.S. military, which has relied on the Alaska Highway as a key route for reinforcements and logistics, found itself facing an unexpected vulnerability, one that could have far-reaching consequences for national security in the coming years. In the days that followed, global markets began to react to the uncertainty. Oil prices spiked, driven by fears of disruptions to the flow of energy resources from Alaska. Shipping routes that relied on access to the Pacific via Alaska now had to be rerouted, driving up costs and complicating global supply chains. Meanwhile, international allies of both the U.S. and Canada scrambled to understand the broader implications of this new reality and how it might affect their own geopolitical strategies. In the wake of this crisis, many analysts are questioning whether the closure of the Alaska Highway signals a permanent shift in Canada's relationship with the U.S.-Canada's decision, while framed as a national security issue and a response to increasing U.S. militarization in the Arctic, raises concerns that the once close alliance between the two countries may be fundamentally altered. What had been a cornerstone of U.S. strategy for securing its northern borders and maintaining control over the Arctic region now appears to be in jeopardy. The consequences for military alliances are no less profound. NATO, which has long relied on the U.S.'s northern borders for strategic defense purposes, now finds itself reconsidering its position in North America. The Arctic has become an increasingly important theater of operations, with both Russia and China aggressively asserting their interests in the region. With the U.S. military's access to Alaska compromised, NATO members are left to question the viability of the Western Alliance's military presence in the Arctic. This shift in strategic positioning could have lasting implications for the balance of power in the region and globally. The geopolitical ramifications of this move also extend to the broader international community. China, already deeply invested in the Arctic through its Belt and Road Initiative, has taken note of the opportunity to expand its influence in the region. Meanwhile, Russia, which has been expanding its military presence in the Arctic for years, could see the disruption of U.S. access to Alaska as an opportunity to strengthen its own position. Both countries have long sought to challenge U.S. dominance in the region, and Canada's actions may provide them with the opening they need to further assert their influence. The closure of the Alaska Highway is a direct challenge to American power in the region, and it is one that may reverberate for years to come. As Canada and the U.S. attempt to navigate the fallout of this unprecedented escalation, the world watches closely to see how the power dynamics in North America and the Arctic will shift in response. This crisis is not simply a matter of transportation and trade. It is a stark reminder that even the most stable geopolitical relationships can be upended in the blink of an eye, with consequences that echo across the globe. In the aftermath of the closure, both nations face a choice, whether to continue down a path of confrontation or seek a diplomatic resolution that could restore stability. For the U.S., this is a test of its ability to respond to a crisis on its own soil, while for Canada, it's a moment to assert its sovereignty and redefine its place in the North American geopolitical order. The next steps will determine not only the future of U.S.-Canada relations, but also the broader balance of power in the Arctic and the world at large. The first signs of a monumental shift in North American relations began to emerge unexpectedly on the morning of June 17th, when Canadian border agents stationed at Dawson Creek, a small but crucial border town in British Columbia, began turning away U.S. military convoys heading northward. These convoys, typically a common sight as they transported supplies and personnel destined for the U.S. military base in Alaska, found themselves abruptly halted without warning or explanation. This was not a simple case of bureaucratic error or administrative oversight. The orders were clear and unambiguous. No U.S. military convoys were to be allowed entry into Canada on the Alaska Highway, the main land route connecting the U.S. to its northernmost state. At first, the move seemed an isolated incident. Surely it was assumed this would be a short-lived disruption, easily resolved through diplomatic channels. However, the situation soon escalated when, within just a few hours, the policy was expanded. The Canadian government issued a sweeping directive through Transport Canada, effectively closing the entire Alaska Highway to U.S. traffic. It was not just military convoys that were turned away, but also commercial shipments, including vital goods and resources bound for Alaska. The new regulation was clear. The Alaska Highway was now closed to unauthorized transit, effective immediately. This abrupt and unexpected decision caught the U.S. government completely off guard. No prior indications had been given that such a drastic step was being considered. American officials, who had long taken the open passage through Canada for granted, were left scrambling to comprehend what was happening. This was not a minor logistical hiccup. It was a profound geopolitical move that struck at the heart of the long-standing relationship between the U.S. and Canada. The move was a wake-up call, signaling a significant and unforeseen change in the balance of power on the North American continent. As the days unfolded, the true scale of what had transpired began to crystallize. This was not an isolated act of defiance. It was the culmination of years of careful planning by Canadian officials who had grown increasingly frustrated with what they saw as American disregard for Canadian sovereignty, particularly regarding the Arctic region. For years, Canadian leaders had felt that their concerns about Arctic sovereignty and the growing militarization of the region were being ignored by Washington. Despite Canada's long-standing claim to the Arctic territories, the U.S. had made little effort to consult its northern neighbor on its Arctic strategies, which included the deployment of military assets and infrastructure in the region. The frustration within Ottawa had been building for years, but the tipping point came when the U.S. began ramping up its military presence in the Arctic in response to rising tensions with Russia and China. Canada's Arctic, once seen as a vast and remote expanse largely free from geopolitical competition, had become the focus of a strategic scramble, with both the U.S. and its rivals setting their sights on the region's untapped natural resources and its critical maritime routes. Canada, which had long considered the Arctic part of its sovereign territory, found itself increasingly sidelined in these discussions. American officials seemed to treat the region as if it were entirely within Washington's sphere of influence, with little consideration for Canada's historical claims and strategic interests. The closure of the Alaska Highway, therefore, should not be seen as a spontaneous decision, but as a calculated move by Canadian officials who had grown tired of being overlooked and disregarded. The speed and coordination with which the closure was implemented suggested that Canadian leaders had been preparing for such a scenario for some time. In fact, experts began to speculate that this had been a long-planned strategy, one that had been kept tightly under wraps, far from public view. As it became clear that the closure was no simple oversight, it was evident that Canada had been working behind the scenes to position itself for a moment like this, a moment when it could assert its authority in a way that would be impossible to ignore. This bold move represented not just a disruption of trade and military movement, it was a direct challenge to American hegemony in the region. The Alaska Highway had been an essential route for U.S. military convoys, as well as for trade and commerce between Alaska and the lower 48 states. The highway was particularly critical during times of military mobilization and national defense, serving as a land-based link between the U.S. and Alaska, bypassing the need for long and costly sea routes. The highway was also integral to the delivery of supplies to U.S. military installations in Alaska, which played a key role in the U.S.'s defense posture in the Arctic. For Canada, however, this move was about far more than just the logistics of military and commercial traffic. It was about asserting its control over a region that had become increasingly important not only for its natural resources, but also for its strategic military and geopolitical value. Canada's decision to sever the Alaska Highway was a sharp reminder that it controlled the passageway to one of the most militarily important regions in the world, and it was now prepared to wield that power to enforce its own interests. For the U.S., the situation was a stark reminder of its vulnerability. The sudden closure of the highway exposed an unforeseen chink in America's strategic armor. The U.S. had long viewed its access to Alaska as a given, a certainty that it could rely on for military and economic purposes. The idea that its northern neighbor could sever that connection with such ease was a sobering realization that challenged assumptions about the stability and predictability of the continent's geopolitical landscape. The U.S. military in particular found itself caught off guard, as it had come to rely on the highway for the rapid deployment of personnel, supplies, and equipment to Alaska in times of need. With the highway closed, the U.S. was left scrambling for alternative routes, forcing it to reconsider its entire approach to defense logistics in the region. Canada's move sent a clear signal to Washington that the geopolitical dynamics of North America had shifted. The days of assuming dominance in the Arctic were over. In the face of an increasingly assertive China and Russia, the U.S. could no longer afford to act unilaterally in the region without consulting its neighbors. Canada had made it clear that it would no longer tolerate being sidelined in these discussions and would take decisive action to protect its sovereignty. The geopolitical earthquake that no one predicted had arrived, and its effects were being felt not only in North America, but across the globe. The closure of the Alaska Highway marked the beginning of a new era in which the balance of power in the Arctic, and beyond, would no longer be determined solely by Washington. At the heart of the escalating dispute between Canada and the United States lies the long-contested Northwest Passage, a strategic sea route running through Canada's Arctic archipelago. For centuries, the passage was largely impassable due to the thick ice that blocked access. However, with the accelerating effects of climate change, the ice is receding, gradually making these once treacherous waters navigable for longer periods each year. The passage, which connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, has become increasingly valuable as a shipping route, as well as a potential gateway to vast, untapped natural resources beneath the Arctic seabed. For Canada, the Northwest Passage represents a critical and undeniable part of its sovereign territory. Ottawa has consistently asserted that the waters surrounding its Arctic islands are internal Canadian waters, falling under the country's jurisdiction. Canada maintains that the passage should be considered part of its territorial seas, just as the waters around its other coasts are governed by Canadian law. This interpretation is backed by a long-standing historical claim and international legal precedents, with Canada seeking to control and regulate the passage for both environmental protection and security reasons. On the other hand, the United States has maintained a fundamentally different view. Washington has consistently argued that the Northwest Passage constitutes an international strait, as it provides a direct route through the Arctic that connects two large bodies of water. Under this interpretation, the U.S. holds that the waters should be open to international shipping, free from Canadian jurisdiction. This legal distinction between territorial waters and international straits is not a mere academic issue. It carries enormous strategic, economic, and environmental implications. The U.S. has repeatedly argued that any restrictions on the passage would disrupt global trade and limit access to vital resources, especially as the region becomes increasingly important for global shipping and energy exploration. The stakes in this dispute have never been higher. With climate change causing the ice to melt and shipping lanes opening for longer periods each year, the once remote Arctic region has suddenly become a key focal point in the geopolitical and economic landscape. The Northwest Passage has the potential to revolutionize global shipping by offering a faster, more direct route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, cutting down on the distance and time it takes to transport goods between Europe and Asia. This could dramatically reduce shipping costs, reshaping international trade routes, and providing significant economic advantages to whoever controls or regulates access to the passage. But beyond its role as a shipping route, the Arctic holds vast untapped resources. Beneath the melting ice lies an estimated treasure trove of natural resources, including oil, natural gas, minerals, and rare earth elements. As global demand for these resources continues to rise, the Arctic is becoming a region of intense competition among nations, especially those with claims to its territory. Canada has long viewed the Northwest Passage as a key to accessing these resources, while also recognizing the need to protect the fragile Arctic ecosystem from exploitation. Meanwhile, the U.S., along with other nations, has made no secret of its interest in the region's potential wealth, and it has argued that international access to the passage is vital for securing global supply chains. Canada's strategic decision to blockade the Alaska Highway is a direct response to the growing tension over the Northwest Passage. The closure of this critical land route, which links the contiguous United States to Alaska through Canada, serves as a clear message to Washington that Ottawa is willing to use its control over Arctic territory to force the U.S. into recognizing Canadian sovereignty in the region. The Alaska Highway has long been a crucial corridor for U.S. military and civilian transport to and from Alaska, but Canada's sudden blockade has demonstrated just how vulnerable the U.S. is to its neighbor's geopolitical power in the region. The Alaska Highway's closure has brought the issue to a head, as it highlights just how much Washington depends on its access to Canadian territory for strategic and logistical reasons. The blockade appears to be a calculated move by Canadian officials to leverage the U.S.'s dependence on this vital transportation route in negotiations over the Northwest Passage. Canada has long struggled to gain Washington's recognition of its claims in the Arctic, and for decades talks over the passage's status have stalled without resolution. The United States' stance on the Northwest Passage has remained steadfast. It continues to view the waters as international straits, despite Canada's insistence that they are internal. Ottawa's frustration with this refusal to acknowledge its sovereignty has been growing, and now with the growing importance of the Arctic region, Canada has decided to use a hard-nosed approach to force Washington's hand. By blocking the Alaska Highway, Canada has placed the United States in a position where it must confront the reality of its reliance on Canada's territorial access. The closure of this critical route not only disrupts the U.S. military and civilian traffic, but also signals a fundamental shift in the relationship between the two countries. It is no longer a matter of minor diplomatic negotiations or informal discussions. The stakes have been raised to the level of national security and economic survival. Ottawa has taken a bold step that threatens to destabilize the status quo and force the U.S. to confront the reality that it cannot continue to ignore Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. For Canada, the blockade is more than just a tactical maneuver. It is a way of asserting its power and sovereignty in a region that has long been treated as an afterthought by much of the international community. By closing off the Alaska Highway and placing pressure on Washington, Canada is signaling that it will not back down in the face of U.S. opposition to its Arctic claims. The closure is also an attempt to demonstrate Canada's strategic importance on the global stage, especially as the Arctic becomes more central to discussions about energy, climate change, and global trade. By forcing the U.S. to negotiate, Canada hopes to achieve a long-overdue acknowledgement of its claims over the Northwest Passage and ensure that the region's future is shaped according to its own interests. The economic implications of the blockade are already being felt, with global markets bracing for the ripple effects of this unprecedented move. The Alaska Highway's closure has disrupted the flow of goods to and from Alaska, causing delays and price hikes in industries that rely on the route for transport. For the U.S., this disruption is especially painful because of its military presence in Alaska and the critical role the state plays in American defense strategy. The United States has been forced to seek alternative routes, some of which are longer and more expensive, while others are less secure and harder to defend. The blockade has revealed vulnerabilities in the U.S. position in the Arctic and exposed the limitations of its reliance on Canadian territory for access to Alaska. The question now is whether this move by Canada will force the U.S. to acknowledge its claims over the Northwest Passage, or whether it will escalate into a broader confrontation between the two North American neighbors. As global competition for Arctic resources intensifies, the situation is only likely to become more complex. What began as a quiet diplomatic memo has spiraled into a continental crisis that could have far-reaching implications for North American relations, global trade, and the future of Arctic sovereignty. The closure of the Alaska Highway has triggered an immediate and catastrophic economic impact on Alaska, revealing the state's deep vulnerability to disruptions in the flow of goods from the lower 48 states through Canada. As a critical lifeline for the state's economy, the Alaska Highway serves as the primary route for nearly 90% of Alaska's consumer goods, including food, fuel, and essential materials for industries vital to its economy. With this vital route severed, the effects have been swift and dramatic. In Alaska's major cities such as Anchorage and Fairbanks, grocery store shelves have begun to empty at an alarming rate. Fresh produce, a staple of Alaskan diets, is among the first to disappear as trucks that normally make daily deliveries have been halted at the Canadian border. In Anchorage, the largest city in the state, families are scrambling to find basic items like milk, bread, and vegetables, with some stores now only offering canned goods and long shelf-life items. The situation is even more dire in smaller, more remote communities, where grocery stores depend entirely on deliveries via the Alaska Highway. For residents in these areas, the closure of the highway has led to the immediate depletion of food stocks, leaving many reliant on emergency shipments or facing the prospect of food shortages that could last for weeks. The fuel crisis has been just as severe. Gas stations across Alaska are experiencing long lines, with many forced to implement rationing measures to manage dwindling supplies. Some stations are limiting customers to just a few gallons of gas at a time, while others have run out completely. In rural communities, where fuel is needed for everything from heating to transportation, the lack of available gasoline has raised concerns about basic survival in the face of an unforgiving environment. The cost of fuel has skyrocketed, with some remote communities reporting prices as high as $8 per gallon, a level previously unheard of in the U.S. Fuel is not only necessary for personal vehicles, but is also essential for the operation of many Alaskan industries, including fishing, mining, and construction. As fuel supplies continue to dwindle, the economic strain on these industries is becoming unbearable. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of the crisis is the profound effect it has had on Alaska's fishing industry, one of the largest and most vital sectors of the state's economy. Alaska is responsible for nearly 60% of the United States' wild-caught seafood, making the fishing industry a critical part of both the state's and the nation's food supply. However, the disruption in supply chains has left processing plants in a perilous position. These plants rely heavily on the Alaska Highway for the delivery of essential packaging materials, such as plastic containers, crates, and labeling equipment, all of which are transported from the lower 48 states via Canada. Without these materials, processing plants have been unable to package and ship fresh fish, causing a massive backlog of catches that are now beginning to spoil. Fishermen, who rely on the processing plants to turn their catch into sellable products, are being forced to discard thousands of pounds of fish, leading to significant financial losses. In addition to the immediate shortages, the fishing industry faces long-term uncertainty. As the state's main economic engine, the fisheries have historically provided jobs for thousands of Alaskans, both directly and indirectly, through processing, transportation, and related industries. The disruption in shipments could permanently harm Alaska's global position as a top seafood producer if the crisis drags on for an extended period. If processing plants are forced to shut down or scale back operations for an extended time, the financial consequences for Alaska's economy will be severe. This includes the potential loss of markets for Alaskan seafood as retailers and distributors look for alternative sources to meet demand. Even if the blockade is eventually lifted, the reputational damage to Alaska's seafood industry could last for years. The damage extends beyond the state's basic goods and industries. Construction projects across Alaska have been delayed or outright halted due to the lack of essential materials that are typically shipped along the Alaska Highway. Lumber, cement, and other materials critical for building infrastructure have been caught up in the transportation breakdown. This is especially troubling in Alaska's remote villages, where construction is often needed for essential projects like housing and schools. As these projects remain in limbo, many Alaskans are left wondering when, or even if, their communities will receive the resources they need to continue growing and developing. The longer the blockade lasts, the more critical the situation will become. While the U.S. government has scrambled to find alternative shipping routes, including rerouting supplies through the Arctic or attempting to deliver goods via airlift, these solutions have proven inadequate to meet the scale of demand. Airlifted supplies are far more expensive and difficult to transport than overland truck shipments, and the cost of these deliveries will only continue to climb as the crisis wears on. Furthermore, the use of alternative routes or air transportation only exacerbates the problem of fuel shortages, as the additional logistics required to move goods by air burns through what little supply remains. For Alaska's residents, the immediate concern is survival. Many of the state's small towns and villages, already operating on razor-thin margins, are now facing a full-scale crisis in terms of access to goods, fuel, and vital services. The emotional toll of the blockade is becoming evident as well, with residents expressing frustration and anger at the situation, compounded by uncertainty about when or if the crisis will be resolved. In many ways, Alaska has become a microcosm of the broader geopolitical tensions that led to the closure of the Alaska Highway. The blockade has exposed the fragility of global supply chains and the enormous dependence Alaska has on its access to the lower 48 states through Canada. What was once taken for granted, the smooth flow of goods through the Alaska Highway, is now the source of a deep economic and humanitarian crisis for the people of Alaska. In addition to these immediate challenges, the longer-term economic impact will reverberate across multiple sectors. If the blockade persists, the state's already struggling economy may face severe contraction, with industries like tourism, mining, and construction taking a significant hit. Alaska, which already grapples with a high cost of living, will face increasing pressure on its already overstretched public services, which will be forced to allocate scarce resources to address the growing crisis. The effects of the blockade will be felt far beyond the state's borders, as the disruption in goods and services affects the broader U.S. economy and international markets that depend on Alaska's resources. The geopolitical fallout from Canada's sudden blockade of the Alaska Highway has extended well beyond economic and logistical challenges, reaching into the realm of military strategy and national defense. Alaska's military infrastructure, crucial to the United States' defense posture, has now been thrust into a precarious situation. The state hosts some of the most critical assets in America's northern defense strategy, including early warning radar systems, strategic air bases, and key nodes in the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. These facilities rely on regular resupply through Canada, both to maintain their operational readiness and to support the personnel and equipment stationed in the region. With the closure of the Alaska Highway, these critical supply chains have been severed, leaving U.S. military installations in Alaska facing significant disruptions in their operations. For NORAD, which coordinates U.S. and Canadian defense efforts in the Arctic, this blockade is a direct threat to the efficacy of its early warning systems and air defense capabilities. The radar systems that monitor potential threats from Russian bombers, missile launches, or other hostile actions across the Arctic rely heavily on the seamless flow of fuel, parts, and personnel through Canada. The current blockade has left U.S. forces scrambling to find alternative supply routes, many of which are either cost-prohibitive or entirely impractical in the long term. NORAD's northern command posts, historically seen as secure and relatively invulnerable, are now facing a strategic reassessment. Senior officers within NORAD are publicly acknowledging the challenges presented by the closure, with some privately admitting that they never considered the possibility of Canada turning against the United States in a continental defense scenario. This unprecedented situation has forced the U.S. military to implement contingency plans that were last updated during the Cold War, a time when the prospect of conflict between Canada and the United States seemed inconceivable. These plans, designed to address potential Russian incursions or other international threats, are now being reconfigured to account for the reality that Canada, once a steadfast ally, is now a potential adversary in the defense of North America. This unexpected shift has had ripple effects throughout the broader defense strategy in the region. For decades, the U.S. military has relied on Canada as a partner in the defense of North America, with both countries sharing common interests in Arctic sovereignty and continental security. The closure of the Alaska Highway represents not just a logistical problem, but a profound challenge to the long-standing assumption that U.S. and Canadian military interests were aligned. In light of this rupture, U.S. officials are now assessing the vulnerabilities that arise from Canada's control over critical access points to Alaska, particularly as the military presence in the region is increasingly vital to monitoring Russian activities in the Arctic. The situation has prompted a visible response from the U.S. Navy, which has reportedly dispatched destroyers to patrol near Vancouver Island, a strategic location at the southern entrance to Canada's Inside Passage. This move is widely interpreted by military analysts as a show of force intended to send a clear message to Canada regarding the seriousness of the United States' position. The naval presence serves as both a deterrent and a signal that the U.S. is willing to assert its dominance in the region should the situation escalate further. While the U.S. Navy's destroyers do not constitute an outright threat, their deployment in Canadian waters is a highly symbolic gesture of military power and a stark reminder of the vast difference in military capabilities between the two nations. Meanwhile, Canadian forces have not remained idle. The Canadian Coast Guard, a symbol of the nation's control over its waterways, has begun closely monitoring American naval movements through the Inside Passage. This narrow, strategically important waterway connects the Pacific Ocean to the Arctic and is crucial for any maritime activity in and around Alaska. The presence of U.S. destroyers in the region has raised tensions, with Canadian vessels reportedly shadowing American ships and keeping a close eye on their movements. These actions, while not overtly confrontational, are a clear indication that Canada is not willing to back down from its position. The Canadian Coast Guard's surveillance of U.S. naval vessels is an assertion of Canadian sovereignty over its territorial waters, a signal that Canada is prepared to defend its actions and interests, even in the face of a powerful neighbor. This militarized response on both sides underscores the gravity of the situation and the potential for further escalation. While neither the United States nor Canada has taken overtly hostile actions yet, the presence of military forces in such close proximity to one another has raised alarms on both sides of the border. What was once a peaceful, cooperative relationship is now teetering on the edge of a more significant conflict. In Washington, policymakers are under increasing pressure to respond to Canada's blockade, while in Ottawa, government officials are aware that their actions have created a delicate and potentially dangerous standoff with the United States. As both sides continue to position military assets in the region, the risk of miscalculation or unintended confrontation grows. The closure of the Alaska Highway and the subsequent military responses have brought the issue of Arctic sovereignty into sharp focus. The Arctic, long viewed as a sparsely populated and geopolitically insignificant region, is becoming a center of great power competition, with both the United States and Canada vying for influence over its strategic waters and territories. The U.S. Navy's increased presence in the region, combined with the Canadian Coast Guard's surveillance operations, is just the beginning of what could become a prolonged standoff. The question now is whether this military posturing will eventually lead to a diplomatic resolution, or whether the situation will spiral into a larger conflict, further destabilizing an already fragile geopolitical landscape. In the wake of these developments, analysts and military strategists on both sides are left grappling with the implications of Canada's sudden shift from ally to adversary. The question remains, can the long-standing relationship between the two nations be repaired, or has the rupture over the Alaska Highway signaled the beginning of a new chapter in North American geopolitics, one marked by heightened tensions and a more adversarial relationship between two nations that once prided themselves on their peaceful coexistence? Only time will tell, but the military, economic, and diplomatic consequences of this crisis are likely to reverberate for years to come. The global reactions to Canada's abrupt closure of the Alaska Highway have been swift, varied, and, in some cases, opportunistic, adding layers of complexity to an already tense and volatile situation. In Russia, state media outlets have eagerly seized on the crisis, with Kremlin-linked commentators drawing attention to the historical irony of the situation. One notably mocking remark referenced the 1867 purchase of Alaska by the United States from Russia, with the commentator quipping that history has come full circle. This comment, while clearly intended to poke fun at Washington's predicament, carries a deeper significance. For Russia, the disruption of the Alaska Highway offers a rare moment to score a rhetorical victory over the United States, a symbol of Western dominance. By framing the crisis in historical terms, Russia has positioned itself as an observer of U.S. folly, gleefully watching from the sidelines as the U.S. grapples with an unprecedented challenge from a North American neighbor. China, ever the pragmatic power, has taken a more cautious approach, but has capitalized on the situation by offering to mediate between the U.S. and Canada. On the surface, this may appear to be a diplomatic gesture aimed at diffusing tensions. However, behind the scenes, Chinese officials have been increasing their purchases of Canadian liquefied natural gas, LNG, which serves to further complicate Washington's position. While publicly advocating for a peaceful resolution, Beijing's quiet but significant economic maneuvers indicate that they are prepared to exploit the crisis for their own strategic gain. By securing additional energy supplies from Canada, China is not only diversifying its energy sources, but also sending a subtle message to the U.S. that its ability to exert pressure on Canada may be limited by Beijing's growing economic influence. This development could alter the balance of power in North America and beyond, as the global economic landscape becomes increasingly interconnected. Meanwhile, European allies have remained conspicuously silent on the matter, reflecting the complex and often contradictory nature of their relationships with both the United States and Canada. Many European nations are bound by formal alliances with the U.S. through NATO, yet they also share long-standing economic and diplomatic ties with Canada. The situation places European leaders in a difficult position. On one hand, they are wary of upsetting Washington, especially in the context of broader transatlantic security concerns. On the other hand, they must be careful not to alienate Canada, which has been a valuable partner in many international initiatives, particularly those related to climate change and global trade. The silence from European capitals, however, may also indicate that they are waiting for Washington to take the lead, preferring not to intervene until the U.S. has clarified its position and response. In Washington, the political firestorm triggered by Canada's actions has reached a fever pitch. President Joe Biden's administration has come under withering criticism from all sides, caught between the competing demands of various political factions. Republicans have pounced on the crisis as another example of Biden's weakness on the world stage, accusing him of failing to defend American interests and asserting that his administration has allowed Canada to humiliate the United States. The GOP's critique centers on the perception that Biden has failed to project strength in the face of an adversarial move by a neighboring country. Republican lawmakers have called for a more aggressive stance, with some even suggesting that the U.S. should consider military options to reopen the Alaska Highway and protect its strategic interests in Alaska. At the same time, progressive Democrats are voicing their concerns about any potential military escalation, warning that such actions would be reckless and unnecessary. They argue that the U.S. should seek a diplomatic solution to the crisis, emphasizing the importance of maintaining positive relations with Canada, a fellow democracy. These members of Congress are particularly wary of repeating the mistakes of past military interventions and are calling for restraint, hoping to avoid any escalation that could lead to an armed conflict between two nations with shared values and a long history of peaceful cooperation. For these progressives, the key question is whether Washington's actions can de-escalate tensions without resorting to military force, which they argue would only worsen the situation and damage long-standing U.S.-Canada relations. Former President Donald Trump's response to the crisis has further inflamed the political debate. In typical Trump fashion, he has made bold and inflammatory statements, promising to send in the Marines to keep that highway open if he were still in office. His comments have resonated strongly with his political base, many of whom view the closure of the Alaska Highway as a direct affront to American sovereignty and global standing. Trump's rhetoric taps into the deep-seated frustrations of a significant portion of the U.S. electorate, who see the current crisis as emblematic of America's declining influence and the erosion of its global power. For Trump's supporters, a strong military response would be a way to restore U.S. dominance and demonstrate resolve in the face of foreign challenges, particularly from a nation like Canada, which they believe should be a loyal ally. On the other hand, Canadian officials have issued stern warnings against any unilateral American action to reopen the highway, reminding Washington that such a move would violate numerous bilateral treaties that have governed U.S.-Canada relations for over a century. Legal scholars on both sides of the border have become embroiled in heated debates about the implications of the blockade and the potential for American military intervention. At the heart of these discussions is the question of whether existing agreements, such as the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, treaty or NATO commitments, would apply in this unprecedented scenario of economic conflict between allies. While NORAD's mandate focuses on mutual defense and surveillance, it does not explicitly address situations like the current crisis, where one member state has imposed an economic blockade on the other. Legal experts are divided on whether NATO's Article 5, which commits member nations to defend each other in the event of an attack, could be invoked in this situation. Some argue that the blockade represents a form of economic aggression that undermines U.S. strategic interests and could be seen as an act of hostile intent. Others contend that invoking NATO's defense clause in this context would be a dangerous precedent, as it would blur the lines between military defense and economic disputes. The legal complexities surrounding this issue have only added to the uncertainty, as both Canada and the U.S. seek to navigate a situation that defies easy categorization. As the situation unfolds, it is clear that this unprecedented crisis is challenging not only the U.S.-Canada relationship, but also the broader structure of North American and global geopolitics. The unfolding events will likely shape the future of U.S.-Canadian relations for years to come, as both nations are forced to grapple with the implications of the Alaska Highway closure and the broader questions of sovereignty, defense, and economic security. The stakes are high, and the coming weeks will test the resolve and diplomatic ingenuity of leaders on both sides of the border. Behind the scenes of this unprecedented geopolitical standoff, intelligence agencies from both the United States and Canada are working at a frenetic pace to assess the long-term sustainability of Canada's position. Early reports suggest that Canadian officials, well aware of the possibility of a drawn-out conflict, had been quietly preparing for such a crisis for months. Sources within Ottawa indicate that the Canadian government has been stockpiling essential goods, including food, medical supplies, and fuel, in anticipation of potential U.S. sanctions or retaliatory actions. This preparation reflects a level of foresight that underscores Canada's determination to avoid being economically crippled in the event of a prolonged confrontation. In addition to stockpiling, Canada has been engaging in discreet negotiations with Asian and European markets, seeking to diversify its trade relationships and reduce its reliance on the United States. These negotiations are seen as a calculated move to minimize the economic fallout of the Alaska Highway closure and to ensure that Canada has alternative export routes for its goods. Canada's vast natural resources, particularly its freshwater supplies and agricultural output, provide it with a unique form of leverage in this standoff. Should the crisis drag on, these resources could become even more valuable, especially in a world where climate change and global resource shortages are increasingly pressing issues. The ability to pivot towards these new markets could give Canada a degree of economic resilience that might otherwise seem impossible. However, the situation is far from simple. Canada's economy, while diverse, remains deeply intertwined with that of the United States, especially in industries like energy, manufacturing, and technology. The reality of this interconnectedness means that a prolonged economic standoff between the two countries could quickly become a mutually destructive scenario. While Canada may be able to weather the storm for a time, the cost of severing such a significant portion of its trade ties with the U.S. would be immense. Both countries are intricately linked through supply chains, with industries on both sides of the border relying on seamless cross-border trade for the flow of goods, services, and labor. Should the conflict escalate, the ripple effects would likely send shockwaves through the global economy, given the size and importance of the U.S.-Canada economic relationship. For the ordinary citizens living on both sides of the border, the human toll of this crisis is becoming increasingly apparent. Mixed families, with members spread across both Canada and the U.S., face the painful reality of separation, as travel restrictions and diplomatic tensions complicate even the simplest of cross-border visits. These families are caught in a limbo, unable to easily maintain the connections they once took for granted. What was once a border that allowed for the free movement of people and goods has now become a symbol of division, creating a deep emotional and practical strain on those affected by the closure of the Alaska Highway. In communities along the border, businesses that were built on the seamless flow of trade and services are now facing the prospect of ruin. Small towns and local economies that relied on cross-border commerce are grappling with how to survive without access to essential resources. These businesses are being forced to navigate an economic landscape that is rapidly shifting beneath their feet, with many struggling to adjust to the reality of a blocked trade route. Restaurants, gas stations, grocery stores, and manufacturing plants in border regions are all feeling the effects of the shutdown, with many of these businesses facing the grim prospect of closure if the standoff continues for any length of time. In places like Hyder, Alaska, a small town that is entirely dependent on Canadian infrastructure for basic services, the situation is particularly dire. Hyder, which shares a border with the Canadian province of British Columbia, has long relied on Canada for essential goods and services. The town's access to health care, food supplies, and other necessities all come through Canada. Now, with the Alaska Highway closed to U.S. traffic, residents of Hyder are facing a surreal and terrifying prospect. They are physically connected to the United States but legally isolated from it. With their primary supply routes cut off, residents have begun stockpiling supplies in anticipation of shortages, fearing the worst as the situation grows more uncertain by the day. The town's residents are caught in a state of limbo, unable to access basic services, while watching the world around them become increasingly divided along national lines. The emotional and psychological impact of this crisis is also being felt on both sides of the border. Communities that were once linked by close cultural, economic, and familial ties are now facing an unprecedented degree of separation. For many, the sense of shared North American identity is being replaced by an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion. The closure of the Alaska Highway has not just affected the economies of these regions, but also the daily lives of individuals who now find themselves at odds with their neighbors across the border. What was once a quiet and peaceful border, where crossing was as simple as a quick stop at a checkpoint, has now become a focal point of tension and division. The broader, psychological impact of the crisis on the citizens of both Canada and the U.S. is something that will take time to fully understand. The implications of being cut off from a neighbor, once seen as an essential partner in nearly every aspect of life, are profound. People on both sides of the border are questioning their relationships with their respective governments and with each other. The very nature of cross-border cooperation, which had been a cornerstone of North American unity for decades, is being called into question. And as the crisis continues, it's unclear how this shift will alter the perceptions of citizens living on both sides of the border, many of whom have grown up with the assumption that the U.S.-Canada relationship is unbreakable. The crisis is still in its early stages, and its full consequences remain to be seen. However, one thing is clear: the human cost is already being felt, both in the personal tragedies of families torn apart and in the struggles of businesses and communities trying to survive in a new, uncertain reality. As tensions rise, the stakes for the future of North American relations, and for the individuals caught in the middle of this unprecedented crisis, could not be higher.